Today on the show, we're very happy to have Layli Maparyan. Did I say that right?
You did.
PhD. She is the Catherine Stone Kaufman 67 Executive Director for the Wellesley Centers for Women at Wellesley College. And she's an expert on the womanist worldview and activist methodology. And we're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Rama.
So I'm going to start right off and ask you where you grew up.
Oh, that's funny. I grew up all over the place because my family moved a lot. I was born when my father was in the process of pursuing his higher education. So when he moved from graduate school to graduate school, our family moved around. I was born in Geneva, New York, but I spent time in Syracuse, New York, some time in New Jersey, some time in Athens, Georgia, where my father got his doctorate. And then finally we landed in Jacksonville, Florida, where he spent his career. So most of my growing up was in Jacksonville, Florida.
Wow, that's quite a spread.
Yes.
So do you have a favorite spot? Do you have fondest memories of any of one of those places?
You know, I really loved Athens, Georgia. And it's so funny that I ended up going back there for my first job.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I really came full circle on that place that I loved from my childhood.
So what is your, how long have you been at the Centers for Women?
I'm in my 5th year now.
Okay. And what is your favorite part about being at the Centers for Women?
You know what I
If you
really
could pick
love?
one.
Well, you know, yeah, I can pick 2 things. I'm gonna say 2.
Yeah.
One is the fact that I love in this job knowing that I'm officially part of social justice work, that I can get up every day and say that my reason for going through the day is to advance social justice causes. But I also really love the team that I work with. I mean, the people who work at the Wellesley Centers for Women are an amazing group of people, so that also gets me up every day.
Yeah. And what do you find surprising? Or what did you find surprising when you first started? And what do you still find surprising now about working there?
It's funny. I think the most surprising thing was how long the honeymoon period lasted in this job. I mean, I just was so excited to be there that I went years and years feeling like I was still brand new and everything was super fresh. And you know, I was probably 3 or 4 years in before that really wore off. So that was kind of a surprise because I never had a job that was that exciting and wonderful before. But I think what surprises me now is something completely different, and that is how challenging it can be to figure out how to position an organization that is oriented towards social justice, but is also on sort of a neutral platform like research when the political climate changes. Figuring out how best to be effective with a changing political climate, to stay responsive and to stay on task, that is probably my biggest surprise right now.
Wow. And do you find that feeling is partly because you're very passionate about what you do?
Certainly. I mean, the passion is there. I'm not one who's easily undone when I face obstacles. I think obstacles probably energize me even more.
So what do you continue to find most surprising about working at the centers?
You know, figuring out how to position ourselves as a social justice organization in a changing political climate is a surprising challenge I didn't expect.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's not that I shouldn't have thought about that, but, you know, I think we, as an educational organization, have to remain focused and neutral in a certain kind of way,
Right.
you know, but we also have to be responsive to the way that conditions change and how different groups in society are impacted by changes in the larger climate. So figuring out how to reposition ourselves is something that has been a surprise that's really we're in the middle of right now.
Right. And do you think that the climate has changed pretty drastically where you'll have to have a sit-down meeting and sort of go over all the goals?
Well, we've found that we've had ongoing conversations. You know, I mean, I think we were all sort of hoping to get our first woman president, and even though we are completely nonpartisan in our work and completely humanitarian in our orientation, we did sort of, we were reading the signs and saying that's what was going to happen.
Right.
And so we were gearing up for that in a certain
Right.
kind of way and getting a different outcome. We've had to figure out how to respond to some of the currents that have been part of that change,
Right.
you know. And that is work I enjoy doing. I enjoy figuring that out, but it is something that is uncertain, you know.
Right.
Sometimes from day to day, you're. So we've had a lot of dialogues
Right.
internally. We've
Right.
had an ongoing conversation from day one. I mean, it's not something where we sort of sit down and it's one and done. I mean, it's something where we have ongoing internal conversations where people share their perceptions, their insights, their ideas, and I share mine, and then we figure out how to move forward together.
And as far as the centers are concerned, do you notice, give me examples of like one current change that, off the top of your head, that people are discussing?
Well, I think one of the things that we're discussing is whether there are going to be any changes in research funding.
Right.
You know, the Wellesley Centers for Women relies heavily on external research funding, particularly from the federal government.
Right.
And a lot of the appropriations that fund the agencies are influenced by political trends. And we don't know yet whether that funding climate will be stable. So we're having to figure out what's our strategy going to be, because we get funding from multiple sources. And we have to figure out if one source shifts, you know, how do we build up another source or whatever. So that's an example of something that we've had to talk about.
Right. And do you foresee any changes in your research area and your research topics due to the current political and funding climate?
Right. Well, my personal research topics won't really change because they aren't dependent on funding per se. But I think that the topics that we cover at the centers, which I'll just name them, education, economic security, mental health, youth issues in adolescent development, and gender-based violence. The relevance of those issues isn't going anywhere. No matter who's in office, those issues are going to be important and relevant. So our work isn't really going to shift, but you know, some of the details of the questions we ask, some of the details of what we're trying to influence with the work. For example, are we going to work to provide information needed for particular kinds of policy development, policy change, et cetera. Those kinds of things will be responsive to climate.
Right. And so tell us about your research topics. What are you currently working on?
You know, for the last several years, actually for a couple of decades now, my main research area has been a perspective known as womanism. And womanism is a social and ecological change perspective that emerges culturally from African women and other women of color from around the world. It comes from the problem-solving experiences and insights of everyday women who are often working at the grassroots with big global problems, but figuring out how to solve them in situ. And looking at the orientation of those women to making change and figuring out how to make more room in global discourse for everyday women and their unique forms of genius. Mm-hmm. So that's what womanism is about. There are many different scholars who've been working on this for a long time. In my first book, what I did was just explore what womanism is through seminal writings collected from the first 25 years of womanist work. In my second book, I expanded womanism from my own perspective. I added my own insights in, and I'm currently working on a third book that collects new research by emerging womanist scholars with the goal of showing that womanist studies has become a subfield in its own right. So my work is more perspectival. It's not really empirical at this point in time, and it bridges the humanities, the social sciences. It's definitely rooted in women's studies and Africana studies, which is the field where I have a professorship. But you know, that work I can just do all the time. Most of the work that we do at the Wellesley Centers for Women, the other scholars' work, is more empirical in nature. It requires them to collect data, analyze data, and you know, that sort of thing.
Right. Wow, that sounds very exciting.
Oh,
so
thanks.
tell us the names of the books and where we might be able to buy a
Sure.
copy.
Well, you can get these books anywhere. My first book is called The Womanist Reader, and my second book is called The Womanist Idea. The book that I'm working on now, I've collected the essays, but I haven't turned the book in yet, is going to be called Womanism Rising. So,
nice.
yeah, the idea that it's, you know, this emergent perspective. And I really think the biggest contribution of womanism right now is to make sure that people who are involved in problem solving, whether it's at a local, national, regional, or international level, stay tuned in with the everyday people, because there's this tendency for people who, for whatever reason, find themselves in elite positions of power and privilege to make decisions for everybody and sometimes forget about the everyday people. And we see what kind of global uprisings are being spurred by that kind of forgetting and that kind of ignoring. And you know, womanism is about bringing us back together and about what insights women of color specifically have to help us do that. How can we stay in conversation when we feel antagonistic with others? How can we you know, respect one another's perspectives, and rather than creating new oppositionalities, how can we come together for more effective and sustainable problem solving?
Wow, that sounds very interesting.
Thanks.
And how does that tie into applied womanism?
Well, applied womanism just means taking the theory and putting it into action.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's a perspective about how to do things, and then there's the doing of things.
And you're an activist scholar. So give me an example of how you apply that and how do you put that into action?
Well, you know, that's a good question. I just gave a presentation at Wellesley College a few days ago for a group of fellows with the Albright Institute, and I talked about the kinds of work that we need to do to make sure that grassroots women are included more at the table of global problem-solving discourse. And I said, you know, for starters, we have to examine why aren't more grassroots women at the table. And we don't look at them, whoever they are, but rather we look at ourselves and what within us is preventing us from viewing women, you know, everyday women as our equals at the table, and also what kinds of feelings or practices might we be engaging in that are preventing us from being more inclusive. You know, so it starts with self-examination. That's very practical. That's applied. We often don't think of that because we like to think about stuff other than ourselves, but we're often the biggest impediment to the things that we want to get done. But then it's also thinking about, you know, how can we take any particular type of issue and bring a slant to it that's more inclusive. I like to think, for example, of the research of one of the researchers at the Wellesley Centers for Women, Dr. Tracy Gladstone. Even though she wouldn't call herself a womanist per se, I think her methodology shows it in the sense that she wanted to figure out how to create a mental health protocol or a preventive strategy around depression for women who are recovering from fistula, which, as you know, is a horrible condition that many women who have had troubled childbirths come down with, and they become ostracized from their communities, or at least they just suffer from grave physical problems until it's corrected. And sometimes once it's corrected, they still have been through a lot of really hard times.
PTSD to deal with from that period.
Right. So if you have women who have the good fortune to get the surgery to repair the condition, there's still often a mental health issue there. And so, you know, how do you involve the people who are recovering from the condition and others in their network in the problem-solving strategy of figuring out a depression intervention, you know, or a preventive strategy? So it's not just, you know, I, as the Western researcher, in this case Tracy, come in and say, well, I've got the solution for you. I'm, you know, a world-renowned researcher on depression, and I know just what to do, but rather saying, you know, I need to ask a lot of questions and be very collaborative and be very humble, and I need to invite the people I'm working with to actually give me a lot of guidance about how best to do this, and how can I be at the service of those people to offer something but also learn something. And, you know, that's sort of a womanist approach in the sense that you're very collaborative, very relational, very culturally respective and culturally responsive in terms of figuring out how to do things, but also bringing the insights that that come from whatever cultures we happen to be a part of without trying to make those invisible or neutralize them. So there, you know, there's a lot of ways I could talk about applying womanism, but it's really about going to the field and changing people's lives for the better. It's about not sitting in an academic institution, but being out in the world.
Yeah, wow. So I forgot my next question because I'm thinking through all the stuff that you just said.
Yeah,
that
well,
sounds,
you know,
that sounds fabulous. That sounds great.
I'll add one additional
Yeah,
thing that's very important. Womanism also tends to have a spiritual component.
Yeah.
And a lot of other social change methodologies don't focus on spirituality as something with transformational potential, because I think a lot of social change strategies that we utilize today come out of sort of a neo-Marxist frame, or something that's more, you know, leave religion to the side or leave spirituality to the side. But womanism comes with the assumption that most people are spiritual, that they respect some higher power, that they have a sense of life's awe and sacredness, and, you know, that there's something divine that's worth engaging. And the assumption is that we can use you know, those spiritual understandings and activities to make the world a better place, even in political and economic ways. You know, something as basic as how you treat someone who has a different point of view in an interaction influences whether that conversation can be productive or not productive. It influences you know, how hospitable you act towards that person, influences whether you're going to find a means to collaborate and break down barriers, or whether you're simply going to re-entrench an enemy relationship. And so focusing on hearts and minds is part of the womanist activist strategy. It's applying it in a way that changes consciousness, changes feelings, changes behaviors, not just changes institutions.
Right.
You know, not just changes laws, but changes how people feel and act.
Right.
Because
And-
that's the source of the problems.
It's very positive and uplifting.
I like to think so.
Yeah, and it's nice because it sort of moves you in a forward direction to
Yes.
create and build further.
Right. And it's not something that overwrites other activist modalities. It's not something that says, you know, the other ones aren't worth it, just do
Right.
this one. But it says, you know, bring this along in the toolkit.
It seems very assimilative. Does it assimilate a lot of things from other activist movements and other theories?
I wouldn't use the word assimilate necessarily, but I might say that it tries to figure out the best utility of each thing and let each thing do its best. It's not a hostile perspective.
Right.
But it is one that can be confrontational when need be, that
Yeah.
does demand accountability when there are problems. I mean, you know, a lot of people say, oh, they think womanism's, you know, too easy on
It's too
justice issues. Of the,
loosey-goosey. Yeah.
but I don't think so. I think really what it does is it forces us to pay attention to the hearts and minds dimension and to recognize that changing consciousness, not just on an individual level, but on a mass scale, is necessary if we're going to sustainably solve our most entrenched global problems.
Wow, that's exciting. And what, in your perspective, do you think are some of these entrenched global problems that face women today?
Well,
in
they face everybody. I mean,
2017?
womanism doesn't focus just on women. It focuses on everybody
Everyone.
from a woman's perspective. And a perspective that invites men and people of all genders and backgrounds to participate and be part of it. But, you know, things like poverty, things like climate change, things like war and violence, you know, whether it's violence against women or violence amongst nations or factions, you know, food security issues, providing universal education. These are the kinds of entrenched global problems that I'm talking about, the things that are our hardest problems to solve, the things that we think, are we ever going to get past this? You know, a lot of people say that, oh, it's human nature to fight, it's human nature to be greedy, it's human nature to do all those things. I think a womanist would turn around and say that we don't need to have such a limited view of human nature, but that if we choose to form ourselves and our children in a new direction and we set up the supports to do that, that we will end up in a new and different place. So it's about articulating what methods are needed. You know, how do we need to raise our kids? How do we need to set up our social institutions? How do we need to treat each other to actually create a sustainable solution to these problems that we think can't be solved?
Wow. Fascinating. That is very interesting.
Yeah, I love it.
And this, I'm assuming this ties in somehow to your improving two-generational family and children relations as well, because you've done some work in that area as well. So
I've done a
tell us
little bit
about
of
that.
work, not a lot, but it's something that I think a lot about and I care a lot about because I really like to see problem solving come from what some scholars refer to as an ecological approach, one that takes multiple factors at different parts of a person's life space and makes them all kind of work together for good. So, you know, a two-generation approach just means how can you help a kid and a parent at the same time, or a kid and a grandparent, depending, you know, whoever, you know, how can you help two different generations in a household both benefit at the same time in ways that are mutual and interlocking, you know, and I think that too often, particularly in the policy arena, programs are set up in ways that only deal with one problem, one issue, one person or one generation at a time, without recognizing that as you influence one person or one problem, a host of other people and issues are also going to be affected and come into play. And so unless you take that into account, you will not have as sustainable, effective solutions.
So those are variables that are important that should be added into the
Yes,
spreadsheet.
and I'm certainly not, I wouldn't call myself an innovator in this, but more someone that has looked at what others have done and said, you know, this is worth pursuing further. At the Wellesley Centers for Women, we did engage in one project where we had a chance to think about some two-generation solutions. Really, it's about how to coordinate activities for parents and children, usually around education, around workforce, around economic empowerment, you know, so what can you do that, for example, a classic example, and this again wasn't us thinking of it, but it's one that you see is, you know, how do you have parents and children studying together when they're both going to school so that they're both, you know, the parents are role modeling studying for the kids, but they're also finding time to do their own studying to advance their own education. The kids are getting, you know, support of the parent's right there. You know, it's not rocket science. But the thing is that what we need more of is coordination of the powers that be, you know, so that policymakers understand that when you set something up for kids, you need to set something up for the grown-ups that are supporting those kids. Or when you set something up for grown-ups who have kids, you need to set it up understanding that they're parents with those responsibilities. And so it takes into account, for example, for social services, setting up more one-stop shops so a person doesn't have to go to multiple places to get their social services. And then remembering things like childcare and transportation and food and, things that make a day go effectively for someone with a kid.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's like, do you have...
Yeah, I can tell you a lot about that part.
Well, we both can, right? And I think anybody with kids can tell you something about that part.
Absolutely.
So
never assume a day has no monkey wrenches thrown
yeah,
in.
it always does. So, how can we make things go better for everybody?
That's so interesting. Yeah. So tell us about some of your upcoming agenda items for, say, the next 3 months at the Centers for Women. What's going on there? What's exciting?
Right. Well, what's exciting to me is really two big initiatives that I think are going to gain more momentum this year. One is that we've been expanding internationally. We have relationships with 2 institutions in other countries. One is with Ashoka University in Delhi, India. And another is with the University of Cape Verde in the Cape Verdean Islands in West Africa. And in both cases, we are, the Wellesley Centers for Women is linked with partner research organizations. In Cape Verde, it's the Center for Research and Training in Gender and Family. And at Ashoka University in India, it's the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality. And we're planning in 2017 joint symposia with both institutions. Mm-hmm. So, we're very excited about that. The other thing is that more on the domestic front, we've had this campaign of policy recommendations for the next administration throughout the entire campaign season. We have a culminating event in Washington, D.C. in June, where we'll be collaborating with some other research institutes in the United States, the Institute for Women's Policy Research in D.C. and the Women's Research and Resource Center at Spelman College in Atlanta. And so we're going to plan this big symposium to talk about issues that we know will continue to be of concern to women and girls, families, and communities in the United States in the coming 4 years. And we're going to talk about what research has to offer in terms of what some good directions for those policies might be. And it's too soon for me to sort of pull the veil off the planned agenda, but stay tuned, check out the Wellesley Centers for Women website to learn more about it. And I think it's going to be really important that we convey a message of bipartisanship. How can we get all parties who are making this policy to work together, because it's all about women and girls, families and communities, and making sure that they experience gender equality, social justice, and human well-being.
Sure. That sounds like a fabulous, that's like world peace. Right there.
I'm always about world peace.
I'm voting for you to solve. I'm voting for you to get
well,
there.
I'm voting for you too, so we'll vote for each other.
That's awesome.
We'll make it happen.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
And when you were a kid, did you see yourself doing all this stuff?
It's so funny. I had no idea what I'd be doing as a kid. My earliest memory of a career aspiration was that I wanted to work for the UN. When I was a kid, our dad used to take us around trick-or-treating for UNICEF with these little orange milk cartons. And I was aware of UNICEF as an organization that did good things for kids around the world, and I thought that was very exciting, and I thought, I want to work for the UN when I grew up, but I had no idea how to make that happen. But what I found funny, one of the things that made me kind of chuckle happily when I started working at the centers is when I realized that we are an officially recognized non-governmental organization of the UN. I said, well, I sort of do work for the UN now, so great.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
One of those funny little recognitions. So we do actually participate regularly in the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women meetings every March in New York and in the NGO forum. And so it's great to be a part of a global enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I bet you've met some amazing women. I
have.
Yeah. Through all that work.
Women from around the world doing amazing things. And I just want to be, able to support their work through research. And I think everybody at the Wellesley Centers for Women is about supporting all these other actors by providing the data and research that they need and the action programs and theory to help them do their best work.
Awesome. And when did you realize that you wanted to be doing this fabulous work as an adult? Was it college?
It evolved
was it high school?
very organically. I thought I would be a professor for a long time, and I was a professor for a long time. And then I got invited to consider this position at Wellesley College, which came at a time when I was ready to stretch my wings a little bit, but wasn't quite sure what that was going to look like. But once I got to know the people here, and of course I already knew the research of the centers because I'd used the research in my own scholarship, but to have the opportunity to come up here and lead the organization has been one of the most exciting developments in my life.
Yeah, awesome. And when is your third book coming out? When's the due date?
I hope that it will come out probably in 2018.
Okay.
Publication process usually takes about a year, and I expect to be turning it in within the next month or two.
Oh,
So,
good.
yeah.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
congratulations.
Thank you.
That's fabulous.
Thank you.
And please add anything else you'd like to mention about the centers or our global environment in 2017 for women. Anything else you'd like to add?
Sure. You know, I would definitely like, particularly our viewers in the Wellesley area or the Metro West area, or even in Boston, to be aware that we have a regular speaker series
Yeah.
at the Wellesley Centers for Women that's open to
right.
the general public. And
right.
I'd love, as I said, to encourage people to go to our website to figure out what the lectures are going to be and come out, learn more about our work.
Right.
We have a number of different kinds of events, and it's it's about not just having things in print, but those human interactions that also inspire everyone to be the best change agent that they can be. You know, we've got so much work to do in this world, and those of us who know that we're a part of that, we've got to encourage each other and keep each other going, because we've got a lot of work to do.
You're so right. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
coming on the show today.
My pleasure.
We'll have to
appreciate
have
your
you back
invitation.
again soon to talk
Anytime.
more about your work and your new book.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much,
you.
Rama. It's wonderful.